One, two, three, four.
Hello, my beautiful listeners, and welcome to SKYLIT. This is the SKYLIT's Books podcast, and I'm your host, Lance Morgan. Today, we're welcoming Rupert Thomson to read from his new book, Barcelona Dreaming. But before I introduce him, I just want to remind you that SKYLIT Books is now open, so please come by. We have limited capacity, but keep an eye on our social media for any changes there. But yeah, come on by, bring a mask, be respectful of other people, and we'll be so happy to see you. We also are still offering online ordering and curbside pickup, so order any books on www.skylitbooks.com. Rupert Thomson is the author of 12 critically acclaimed novels, including The Insult, which was shortlisted for the Guardian Fiction Prize and chosen by David Bowie as one of his 100 must-read books of all time. Death of a Murderer, which was shortlisted for the Costa Prize, and The Book of Revelation, which was made into a feature film by the Australian writer-director Anna Kokinos. His memoir, This Party's Got to Stop, won the Writers Guild Nonfiction Book of the Year in 2010. His short story, To William Burroughs from His Wife, was shortlisted from the 2016 Costa Short Story Award. He's a fellow of the Royal Society of Literature and has contributed to the Financial Times and the Guardian, Granta, and the London Review of Books, and The Independent. After living in many places around the world, including Berlin, New York, Sydney, Rome, Los Angeles, Amsterdam, and Barcelona, he now makes his home in London. Rupert, it's so great to have you here. Thank you for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having me on, Lance.
No problem. No problem. It's gonna be exciting. Thank you for joining us from across the pond. Right? Sorry I said that. That's so.
I wish I could actually be there.
Yeah. No. I mean, well. I appreciate you. It's 1 p.m. for us here, but for our listeners, it's not. It's 9, right?
Yeah,
Over
it's
there.
9:15 in the evening.
So thank you for doing this so late for you.
Oh, sure. Anything to be in touch with Los Angeles.
Thank you. We love it. We love it. So you have a reading for us today?
I do. I should set it up a little bit. It comes from near the beginning, but the narrator of this section is a woman called Amy. She's in her early 40s. She's English, but she's lived in Barcelona for a long time. She runs this little gift shop. And she's just moved into a new apartment on the ground floor of a building. And underneath her, in the basement of the building, is an underground car park. And she has to get used to these strange noises in her apartment because the acoustics in the apartment are really strange. So, you know, she can hear like people unlocking their cars. She can hear the chink of keys. She can hear people on their cell phones. And it's really clear as if they're in the apartment, but they're not. They're below, you know, they're underground. And one night she's woken by the sound of someone crying. And it sounds really close and it sounds like a man. And she decides to get up in the middle of the night, get dressed, and she goes down to the underground car park to investigate. And she finds this young Moroccan man. He looks to be about 19 or 20 and he's in tears and he's clearly been through something traumatic. And she invites him back to her apartment, which is kind of a risk, but she wants to help him. And she gives him a cup of tea and she settles him. And when he's ready, she takes him out onto the street and gives him money for a cab and he leaves. And she kind of feels like she's helped someone who is in distress. And she thinks that's the end of it. But then he turns up 4 days later outside the apartment with these shopping bags. And he says he wants to cook for her as a way of thanking her. So this is what happens. His name was Abdul, he told me, and he was from Tangier. He'd been living in Barcelona for about 6 months. He'd learned to cook when his mother was knocked down in the street and broke her arm. He was 14 then. As the oldest of 3 children, he had to take over in the kitchen. His mother would issue instructions from a nearby chair. No, not like that, she said. he said, imitating her. Cut into smaller pieces. Stir more slowly. You forgot the salt. He was smiling. He hadn't seen her in almost 3 years. She was still back home in Morocco. That evening, Abdul cooked a lamb tagine. He'd arrived with everything that he would need, not just the meat, but tomatoes and onions, dried apricots, fresh coriander, and his own herbs and spices wrapped in twists of rough brown paper. He even brought a terracotta cooking pot with a lid. We ate at the small table on my terrace. I lit candles and opened a bottle of red wine. As a Muslim, Abdul was content with fruit juice. His Spanish was no more sophisticated than my French, and he didn't have any English at all, but we had no trouble communicating. I asked him about Morocco, a country I'd never visited. His father's family were Bedouin, he said. They lived in the mountains to the south of Marrakesh. He was open and talkative, nothing like the tense, wary person I'd come across in the small hours of Thursday morning. He didn't seem to find it awkward to be alone with a woman from a different culture, a woman he barely knew. And I caught myself hoping it wasn't on account of my age. At least once that evening, while in the bathroom, I leaned close to the mirror, examining my face. People were always telling me how young I looked, how me and my daughter, Ma, could easily be sisters. But that was just something people said, wasn't it? On my way back to the terrace, I paused in the shadows at the far end of the living room. I could see Abdul through the sliding glass door. Gazing out into the night, with his chin propped on one hand, he looked at home, at ease. The fact that I'd met him when he was at his lowest had given him, paradoxically, a kind of strength. After all, in his own eyes, he would never be less of a man than he had been on that first night. It grew late, but the idea that he should leave didn't occur to him. His complacency made me smile, and I had to turn away so he didn't notice. I didn't want him thinking I was mocking him. Busying myself at the sink, I told him I had to be up early in the morning and that it was probably time he went home. With anyone else, this would have been rude. Not with him somehow. He stretched lazily, as if he had also drunk a little too much rioja. Then he gathered up his cooking pot, which I had washed, and his remaining herbs and spices, and packed them into the carrier bag he'd brought with him. Once I'd showed him out of my apartment, we stood on the thin strip of pavement at the front of the building. Aware that my neighbor's living room window was open, I stepped closer to Abdul and spoke in a low voice. I thanked him for cooking for me. He nodded, then studied his feet. For the first time that evening, he seemed on edge, as if he was waiting for something. And I remembered how on Thursday night I'd given him cab fare. He was too embarrassed to bring it up, perhaps. Do you need money to get home? I asked. I'll take the metro, he said, or a bus. He turned away, but then he turned back. Did you think about me? I'm sorry. I wasn't sure I'd understood. Did you think about me on Thursday night after I had gone? His eyes were earnest and sober, as if the matter troubled him, but I still couldn't work out what he was asking. Before I had time to answer, he spoke again. I thought about you. A car came up the narrow street with its headlights on full beam, and as I half closed my eyes against the glare, one of its wing mirrors clipped my thigh. I let out a faint cry, but the car was already past me and turning onto Avenida Foch. Abdul put a hand on my upper arm near the shoulder. Are you all right? I'm fine, I said. It was a shock, that's all. His hand remained where it was, his gaze intent, unfathomable. He seemed older just then, and I thought I could imagine how he might age. Threads of white in those dark curls and fine lines at the edges of his eyes and mouth, but still something extraordinary to look at. Really, I said, it was nothing. I looked away from him, but felt his gaze rest on me for a moment longer. Then he took his hand from my arm and walked off down the street in the direction of the metro station. I stood and watched him go, his head poised, almost afloat in the air. After what he had said, I could feel my heart beating. It had slowed down and seemed at the same time to have become more powerful, more urgent. And I thought he might look over his shoulder, just a glance, but he didn't, not even once.
Wow, listening to you read that, that's so, I could feel your connection to these characters so well.
Well, that's the idea, I guess. I mean, you write
You're
these
right.
people, you write these people again and again, and in the end, you know, they seem more real than the people who turn up at your door, you know.
Yeah. I mean, and that's so true, but just like, I don't know, I feel like more than a lot of other writers I've heard speak, I just felt it in I felt the compassion for these characters in a way that I really
Well,
appreciate hearing.
I think there's a quality of I kind of call it tenderness, you know. I mean, I think compassion is incredibly important in fiction. I mean, I think you can't really write fiction unless you have a certain amount of compassion.
Yeah.
And you know, there's almost something about fiction which is underpinned by the whole idea of compassion. You know, the very idea that as a writer you try and inhabit other people's lives. You know, to greater or lesser extent you're successful. You know, but you're trying to imagine what it's like to be someone else. Right. And there's something about that which I think which I think everyone can do, you know, can carry through their lives. You know, it's kind of an important characteristic for people to have.
Yeah.
You know, how can you ever help anybody unless you can imagine what it's like for them? And you know, and it's hard, you know. I mean, for instance, you know, you're black and I'm white. And it's incredibly hard to imagine what it's like for the other, I think, you know. I mean, we do our best, you know, everyone tries, or everyone should try, but, you know, it's trying to bridge that gap, trying to put yourself in someone else's shoes that I think is incredibly important.
And that, I mean, is very, yeah, in your book, it seems like you are trying to do that with your characters, trying to bridge that gap, trying to really, and it's like you're not trying to force it either. I feel like there's a sort of just like.
I mean, the thing is that it's, and also, you know, in that scene, you've essentially got the two very different worlds. You know, you've got the white woman who, okay, she isn't from Barcelona, so she is herself an immigrant. But, you know, she's one of the privileged immigrants. You know, she's one of the ones who can choose where she wants to be. And then on the other hand, you've got Abdul, who is, you know, is the other kind of immigrant, the one that we generally talk about, who's he's possibly an economic immigrant, we never really find out, but, you know, he's clearly escaping a world in which he can't survive, and he's trying to come to a place where he thinks he can, and of course something bad has happened. So you have the collision of these two worlds, and you have Amy trying to help him. And of course, this is just the beginning, you know, when he says, "Did you think about me?" There's a clue in that as to what's going to happen in that particular story. But it's a huge risk for both of them. You know, they're about to enter something quite dangerous, and actually it turns out to be dangerous. And the reason being is, and the reason it's dangerous is because, in a sense, there's a racist element to the story. You know, it's driven by a character who is racist, and these two characters who you just heard, who are described so tenderly, they're exposed to the attention of this man who is a different kind of person. You know, who's the kind of person we want to change.
Right. And that, like, yeah, no, that's, I feel like is a it must have been, I'm imagining, tenuous like bridge to cross, finding those, like, that story in there and finding the right balance to get that truth in that story, whatever that, like, the truth of the characters in that story.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I think that you know, because we haven't said, but, you know, this is a novel. I call this a novel, but it's actually three long short stories. They're about 70 pages each, and they're connected by time and place, you know, so they're all set in Barcelona in the early 2000s, so just prior to the crash of 2008. So in a sense, it's a pre-crisis book. You know, there's a crisis about to happen, and there's a sense of foreboding. There's a kind of feeling that something's about to happen, and all these characters are going to be changed.
Like a storm before the calm kind of thing.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, calm before
the
the
other way
storm.
around.
The other way around. Oh no!
Although I like the idea of the storm before the calm.
Yeah, I mean, that's sometimes that's also true. But no,
you were probably thinking of the dark before the dawn.
The dark before the dawn is probably the thing. Yeah,
you could mix those two up. No, but the thing I was going to say was, so you've got these three stories that are linked by time and place, but they're also linked by certain characters. You know, so a character who plays a cameo role in one story, you know, just makes an appearance at a party or in a room, might be the main narrator in the next story. You know, you don't know. But the one thing that links all the stories is this crime that's been committed against this young Moroccan man. And this crime is there right from page 3 or 4, you know, right, even from before the place where I read. It's clear that some kind of crime has been committed, and this crime throws a shadow through the book, you know, because you do end up finding out the perpetrator of the crime, and the perpetrator even, you know, there's a kind of justice that is delivered, but it's not at all the kind of justice that you might expect. So, you know, there's kind of all kinds of subtle connections between these three stories, but in a sense, they all stand alone as well. You know, rather like kind of, I think of them like fairy tales almost. They all have fairy tale titles. You know, it's the giant of Sarriá, the king of Castelldefels, the carpenter of Montjuic, and those are three different areas of Barcelona. But you know, the idea of the king, the giant, and the carpenter, they're almost like fairy tale characters.
Well, I feel like one of the best things about, like, I mean, writing about a city like Barcelona is that there is a kind of fairy tale element to it. There's stories, and there's stories that feel kind of like folk tales in like a city like that. And I feel like a lot of cities have that. Like Los Angeles has that, probably London, you have that there too. But like
I don't think so. I weirdly don't feel that in London. I absolutely agree with you about Los Angeles and about Barcelona. I mean, because the thing about Barcelona is there's kind of magic on the streets happening almost every day. And one of the reasons for that is because that it's obviously it's a Catholic country. And so they have all these saints' days. And so there are endless festivals. You know, you'll come out of your door one evening and there's like men running down the street dressed as sheep, letting off fireworks, you know, and you think, what's going on? I've no idea which festival this is, but it's great. You know? And so then you get things like, I remember that my office in Barcelona was in a convent. It's a long story, but it was in a convent at the back of the city, and the little tiny city bus that only held about 20 people that went up to that part of the city. And one day I got in there, and you know, there's a kind of tray next to the driver where you'd normally put your change. The people who were paying by cash, that is. And there was this great bunch of wild mint, the plant, you know, in the tray where the money should be. And I asked the driver, I said, what's this doing here? And he said, oh, you know, it's just this old guy who lives right in the hills at the top of the city, and he just found all this beautiful fresh mint, and he wanted to give me some, you know, as a little present. And you know, that kind of thing just doesn't happen in London. There was some kind of connection with the land, and connection with the seasons, and connection, and as I've said, kind of with religious life, with the deep past, you know.
No,
you don't get.
You don't get. I mean, maybe it's I lived down in London for school for a little bit, and I don't know. There was something. Sometimes I would be like wandering, and I would find myself in certain places where I'd be like, wow, this is things that would happen that I'm like, feels very fantastical in some sense. But maybe that's me as an outsider. But no, I feel like
It could be, I mean, yeah, sorry, go on.
No, I was just saying the way you describe Barcelona, though, yeah, I feel like there might be more of that energy and that emotion there. And
the book actually, you know, it's interesting, Lance, because the book actually came out of that feeling. You know, it came out of my love of the place, because I moved there in 2000. I actually lived there for nearly 7 years.
Oh wow!
And I was in love with the place, and I was embedded in it, and I was speaking Spanish, but not Catalan. But I kind of, when the crash happened, I realized that I was going to have to leave, you know, that we couldn't afford to be there anymore. And we clung on for another year. But there was an evening when I came out of my office, my little room, my office is a bit of a grand name for it. When I came out of my room in the convent, and to get home, I would walk down 3 hills. And at the top of the first hill, and you know, the sun would be setting by the time I finished work. And I remember just looking at the city laid out below me, half of it in shadow, half of it still in sunlight, because the sun was setting behind me. And I looked at it and I thought, you've got to remember this. You've got to burn this into your mind, because soon you won't be seeing it anymore. And there was a kind of heartbreak about that. And I was feeling a kind of nostalgia for something that wasn't even over yet, you know, but I knew it was going to be over. And as you said in your introduction, I've lived in a lot of places in the world, but this was the first time that I'd ever really had this feeling of loss. And it was out of that feeling that I decided to start writing about the city. And it was really literally in the last 3 months of my time there. From one day to the next, I decided to try and capture the city, you know, by writing about it. I had no idea what was going to happen when I started writing. All I had was the image, which I've already described, you know, at the beginning of this, was the sound of a man crying in the middle of the night. Because the office I'd had previously to the one in the convent was, I've always had strange offices. I don't know why it is, but you know, I end up in the weirdest rooms. The first room I worked in the city was an old classroom on the ground floor of a building. It had no windows. It had yellow walls, and it was huge, like a squash court. You know, it was like 25 feet by 25 feet with a blackboard. And I had to leave the door open, because otherwise I'd kind of asphyxiate, you know. I'd use up all the oxygen in the room, and I just kind of pass out. But underneath this classroom, this room I worked in, was an underground car park. So I used to hear people jingling their keys, and I used to hear people on their cell phones, and it was really, really clear. I could hear what they were saying. So I suddenly had the idea of hearing someone crying in that car park. And that's all I began with, and I just ran with that. And I had no idea of where I was going or what was going to come, you know. So, so that's how the book began, as a kind of love letter to the city, and then it kind of turned into something else. Because, you know, in some ways it's quite critical of the city, certain aspects of the city, like, as I've mentioned already, the racism was perhaps more evident than it would be in London, because the population was much more divided, you know. And I think in those small cultures like Barcelona, you know, they have the Catalan culture, and they have to protect the culture. But in protecting the culture, they tend to have the danger with protecting your own culture and overprotecting it is what comes with that is a kind of xenophobia and racism, because you start fearing the other, you start fearing the people who are coming in, you know, who you feel are changing your culture. So, you know, there was a lot of fear of the Moroccans. There was you know, and friends of mine, I had a Japanese friend and an Indian friend, both women. They both, at certain points in their time there, people would assume they were someone else's maid, simply because they were foreign, you know. So I kind of, the racism was really quite apparent in a way that in London London's much more of a mixed population, you know. Actually, in London, in London now, white people are in the minority.
Mhm.
We're less than 50%, you know, which I always thought is a great thing. You know, the one thing you're talking about having been in London, I think the one wonderful thing about London is it's such a melting pot. You know,
Yeah.
you really have people from everywhere, and you never know who you're going to meet when you walk around the corner. You know, the city is full of extraordinary people. So that's the reason why I love it, but not for anything else.
And that, I mean, what you just said too about, I kind of want to go back on what you said about when you were leaving and that feeling of wanting, of like, you know, burning that image into your mind because you had that feeling of loss there. Do you think with writing this book and after seeing it and seeing how it was received and it's going to be, you know, it's going to be read, and also just like rereading and going back to it, that you've kept that memory now, and now is this your way of kind of?
The book is such a different thing. I mean, the thing, you know, the way I really had no idea how I was going to try and capture the city. So, you know, this book is kind of a surprise to me because I didn't know that's what I thought until I finished it. And you know, it's often the case with a book. You don't really know what you're doing until you've done it.
That's true.
And it's really interesting to get other people's reactions because you know, for me, other people's any reader's reaction is as valid as mine. You know, any reader's opinion is as valid as mine, because that's the whole magic of a book. You know, the point of the book is that the book is in the middle, and there's a reader on one side and there's a writer on the other, and the reader and the writer will probably never meet, but they sort of meet through the book. And the book has an effect on the reader, and then you know, and if you're lucky as the writer, you'll start to hear those things from the reader, and you'll hear what they think. And it's nearly always a complete surprise. You know, one thing that people have said, which is, I suppose, gratifying, is that the sense of place is extraordinary. You know, that someone just wrote to me today and said, "Wow, I can really smell the city." You know, and that idea of the old Flannery O'Connor idea, Flannery O'Connor being one of my favorite writers. You know, she said fiction operates through the senses. And I've always tried to write in that way, like all the senses, you know, not just obviously sight is the obvious one, but you know, you want to feel like you're touching things, smelling things, as well as feeling them. So, you know, that's a lovely thing to hear. That people have also said, you know, I almost feel like I've been to Barcelona now, even though I've never been there. You know, this is like the best way to travel. And of course, that's true of fiction. You know, when fiction takes you places, and if it's done well, you feel like you're there.
Today's episode of SKYLIT is brought to you by Rare Bird Lit. Critics have called it gripping and a must-read. Unstoppable by Joshua M. Green is the unbelievable true story of Ziggy B. Wiltzig's astonishing journey from Auschwitz survivor and penniless immigrant to Wall Street legend. Out now in hardcover from Insight Editions. Now, back to the episode.
Well, it's one of my favorite things as a bookseller to like help people find is that, like, I mean, especially in the past year when people have been kind of landlocked and not able to go travel and see new places. And I mean, like a place like
there's been a hunger for books, hasn't there?
There's been a hunger for books, I think, to escape. It's like the escapism of, I mean, especially we're in London, I can imagine, or any like Europe, because it's so easy to travel there. I imagine people are hungry for that, and so a book like Barcelona Dreaming, I think, is very important to come out to help people like discover the way that you see Barcelona too, and the way that you've discovered how you see Barcelona. And I mean, like one of the things I love to do as a bookseller is get people to different spaces like that. So
I used to work in a bookstore as well. I worked in this famous bookstore in New York called The Strand.
Oh yeah, I love The Strand.
Are you from New York or?
I'm from Connecticut, so I'm from right outside of New York. So I've been to New York many times. Yeah, I've been to The Strand. Yeah, I love The Strand.
Yeah, so there was a fascinating place to work, and you know, you find that you're in then you start looking at all the people who've worked there, like Patti Smith, and you know, and then like Mary Gateskill, the writer, also worked there. But I mean, one of my favorite things was always to steer people towards, people would come up to me and say, I like this kind of thing, but I can't find anything and I'm not sure what's going to be like that. And you say, oh, right, well, have you tried this? I love that whole recommending thing. Or sometimes you go totally left field and say, I think you should try this,
Yeah.
Something maybe you've never heard of or thought of. I love that.
I mean, the other day I was telling someone, was like, I love all this nonfiction. I'm like, that's great. I can see the theme that you like in nonfiction there, and I can find a similar theme in fiction where you get that escapism and you get to see someone else's. I mean, with everything that happened last year with the Black Lives Matter movement, one of my things was not to recommend people nonfiction, but to recommend them fiction, so they get the same feeling and the same education they're getting from the nonfiction while being able to see another perspective, which I think is very important. And like a book like yours with 6 or 7 different perspectives, like narratives in there, I think is so important for people to see this other world that they wouldn't have experienced if they didn't look for this kind of fiction. And
you've kind of also got a big, the range of voices is quite wide in this book as well. So, you feel like hopefully you feel like you're visiting every corner of the place, or you're getting this very rich slice. Let's put it like that. You're getting a rich slice of it.
Exactly, and I think, you are getting that rich slice of it, and it's just, I mean, your book is a love letter to Barcelona, but also it seems like a love letter to that time period you said earlier you were in Barcelona right before the crash, and during what about that specific time period were you like, that's where I want to set my book? We kind of said like it was the calm before the storm, but like what about that calm that made you say that's the space I want to write this in?
Well, no, it was just force of circumstance, because I was simply, the moment when I started writing, I was thinking I'm going to capture the Barcelona that I'm about to leave. And in a way, the crash was coming, but I was kind of capturing that golden moment or that golden era just before. And it was odd because there was always a sense in the early 2000s in Barcelona that things were too good. I couldn't quite believe how people were living and how easy everything was. And you kind of forget that, because now, of course, with the virus and the pandemic and everything, people are talking about getting back to normal, that we've been through this thing and there's this idea that we want to get back to normal. But of course, there isn't such a thing as normal, It wasn't normal before because that was always how it was. It was like that for a little bit, but before that, it was like something else. So there is no normal to go back to.
Right.
And of course, we're not going to go back to normal because we're going to have been changed by what's happened. We can't help but be changed. The whole idea of sorry, go on.
No, I was going to say there was like 8 different things that happened last year on top of the pandemic too. So how could we go back from all these big events that have happened?
I think once I was writing about that time, then I loved the idea of it's almost like the way people talk about how Europe was before the First World War. There was this idyllic feeling, apparently, and there was it was just a golden time, and then everything was smashed. And weirdly, we've lived through 2 of these things now. We're living through one now. We lived through one then, and we sort of forget that's what life is made up of, those sudden changes and those unexpected things, and of course that should be, I guess I'm a cup half full person, but I always think those things should be a dynamic thing rather than a negative thing. The idea that we can't get back to how it was isn't a bad thing, because actually we needed to change quite a lot about how things were, and I think that really strongly about now is that it frustrates me that so many people are talking about getting back to normal, because I think that we should be using this time as a way of as a way of actually rethinking the world that we live in. You know, there are so many things wrong with the way we're living, and there's a lot that needs to change. And you know, the fact that in London was extraordinary this time last year, because you know, we live in this room, you know, I live under a flight path into Heathrow.
Okay. Oh, wow.
So, you know, from about 5:30 in the morning, planes start coming over, and they come over about every 90 seconds.
Oh, wow.
Suddenly last year, you know, in the spring, the skies were quiet.
Yeah.
You could hear the birds. The air was fresher because no one was driving. And, you know, and instead of saying, why don't we make London more like this? People talk about going back to how it was before, you know, whereas actually what we need to do is clean up the air and clean up the skies. So, you know, it's kind of, I think young people have a better handle on this than older people. You know, it's the older people tend to want to keep things as they are, you know, it's a fear of change.
It is. I mean, there is. I see that when I was the same thing about a year ago. There was less people on the roads. People were out walking. People were just like, you know, being outside more because they felt safer outside. There was more communication. Like you were talking with people. I was talking with friends around the world that I hadn't talked to recently because we were trying to make sure we were okay. And then, I mean, there was a lot of bad. I mean, a lot of bad last year. But I mean, there was things that I feel like could stay the same in how we, the cleaner air, the caring about the environment more, people being more resourceful and reaching out and communicating more. No, that's in the way that you even just.
Did you notice how also certain friendships? Have you had this experience where certain friendships have started over the phone or over Zoom? You know, where, you know, you don't actually ever see that person in real life, but this friendship develops with someone you've hardly knew, and it becomes quite intense because you know, every time you phone someone, it's like an hour and a half,
right?
Because you know, because it's instead of seeing them,
exactly.
You know, and you can't go and see them.
And it's, I mean, I've connected with, I can probably like 4 or 5 people that I haven't talked to in like 10 years that I'm now like talking to regularly again because we just, we found a new way to connect that way. I feel like technology before pre-pandemic was like, oh, we don't want, if we're not seeing each other face to face on the regular, we're not talking to each other. But then we were like, oh, that's completely not an option anymore. So then we were like, oh, I mean, technology definitely has its negatives, but then this felt like a big positive of us being like, oh, I'm going to share this part of my life with you in a way that I wasn't able to before. And like, it felt so important to have this, you know, amazing connection with people. But also what you were saying before of like, seeing the time period in the way that your book has it, like the right before this, you know, this new period in the world. It reminded me of, have you read Rebecca Mackay's The Great Believers at all?
Nope.
It's a fantastic book about like the half of it takes place during the Chicago and the AIDS crisis. And there's a character in there who was in France during right before the Second World War, I believe. And she says that there was the idea like this Renaissance period of just artists and, you know, lovers and beautiful people just in the city, just the most amazing people she's ever met in the city. Then the war happened, and then there's this new period of just like, you know, all of that was lost during that. And like,
I don't mean to talk about myself again, but
yeah, no, please do. This is about you.
The weird thing is, you're describing something I dealt with in my last book, which was called Never Anyone But You, which is about these two French women who were lovers. They were lesbians in Paris before the Second World War, and they fought the Nazis. You know, they fought in the resistance, but their own particular campaign against the Nazis. And you know, they were part of that Paris. That Paris that you're talking about, where it's basically Paris was the capital of the world culturally at that time. You know,
Mm.
everyone who was anyone was there.
Yeah.
You know, so you
Yeah.
could walk around a corner and there was a Hemingway and there was Picasso and, you know,
Mhm.
you name it, they were all there. So it was an
And
extraordinary period.
I mean, like, and then it was to imagine all of that loss in the same way that, I mean, Rebecca Mackay talks about like the height of like this like gay and queer renaissance in different
Yeah,
cities where it was a very like queer, and you found a community that was ripped apart by this disease that came out of nowhere.
yeah,
And it's kind of, I mean, it reminds me of your book where this financial crisis came out of nowhere, but there was this period beforehand of just like love and connection and humanity before that. And I mean, happening right now with the pandemic. There was that, and I mean, there might be afterwards. The way people are talking about how things are gonna be after the pandemic, which is that's its own thing. It feels like before there was this like, oh, the things I did before, I didn't even realize how good I had it and how much
yeah,
fun I was having beforehand.
yeah.
So
That's
I
just
think
the
that
way. It's the taking for granted, you know, it's like you have to
exactly.
keep, it's almost like as time goes by and as you're living, you kind of have to
Hmm.
remind yourself to never take things for granted. I try and
Exactly.
do that, you know. It's
Hmm.
really hard though, because but you have to remind yourself that these things are luxuries in a way, you know, the things that you have.
Yeah.
Um, the weird
I
thing is
mean,
I'm writing now the book.
hmm.
I started a book on Valentine's Day last year, so the pandemic hadn't started. I mean, it had started, but we didn't
Yeah.
really take it seriously at that point. There was some cruise ship, you know, moored off Tokyo,
Yeah.
and there were people dying on that ship, the Diamond Princess, I think it was called. And I remember
Yeah.
this news item in January, February last year. And I remember thinking, oh, that's a really interesting setup for a novel. You know, this ship
Hmm.
marooned off the coast of a major world city, and they can't get
Yeah.
off. You know, and people are dying. And I
Right.
never really imagined what was going to happen as a result of that.
Yeah.
But I started a novel, and weirdly, it's doing it's this. There's a similarity with the one we're talking about tonight, you know,
Hmm.
or today, in the sense that I'm setting it in 2019,
Hmm.
just before the pandemic hits. So it's another it's going to be another pre-crisis book, except this is going to be about someone who decides that they have to take action about the way things
Hmm.
are. You
No, I
know,
mean, that's
quite extreme.
that. I mean, yeah, and I mean, but also like, it's something I feel like people will be able to connect to in that,
Yeah,
in especially right now. And I think that's, I mean, with Barcelona Dreaming, I feel like you are definitely finding to come out right now, to come out in this space, or very it's something everyone will be able to connect to. Everyone lived in the world. Everyone, I mean, except for like, children who might
yeah,
not be able to connect to this that well.
yeah,
But every person has experienced right now the world pre-pandemic and during the pandemic, and
yeah,
can be able to really appreciate, I think, in a way that maybe we were taking for granted before, that period of peace before calm before the storm. I'll bring that
yeah,
back.
yeah,
And hopefully there'll be a calm after the storm, a storm then calm. Um, well, I think this has been a fantastic talk, Rupert.
Oh,
This
it's
has
been
been
lovely talking to you.
Thank you
And
so
it's
much.
so great to have an interview that's like a conversation,
Yeah,
you know, because
this
I
felt
kind of I've always hated the formal question and answer
right.
thing, you know, where it
Hmm.
goes back and forward and it's a bit sterile,
Right.
you
No,
know. And okay,
this
maybe there's lots of things we haven't talked about to do with the book, but I mean, as long
I
as
mean
you had a good
this
time.
I mean, is there anything else about the book you would like to talk about? I mean, I felt like we covered like the emotion and the
Yeah.
time period and I mean, and just like, got to know, I think the listeners got to know you and got to know what motivated you and how you feel about the book. And
Well, you know, yeah, I totally agree, because there's no, you know,
mhm,
there's never any point, which is what a lot of book reviews do, where the book
yeah,
reviews basically tell you what happens in the book. You know, there's no point in me telling you what happens in the book. Otherwise, I
Right.
might as well not have written it.
Go
So it's
on.
much better to talk around, you know, more abstractly around the themes and around the feeling and around the emotions. Those are the important things.
I mean, you could probably understand this too as a bookseller at the Strand. I mean, of all bookstores to work at. But I mean, as a bookseller, you don't want to tell people, I don't like telling people about the book. I want them to feel how I feel about the book more than more than anything. I want them to.
Do you know this, Lance? Do you know this amazing Russian film director called Andrei Tarkovsky?
Yes,
he did movies like The Sacrifice, and he had this wonderful. He wrote this book called Sculpting in Time.
Oh, wow.
It's basically about it's about making films, but it's almost like a creative manual. You know, it's about how you create and what it's like to create. And in there, he says, a book read by 1,000 different people is 1,000 different books. And I just love that, because it's exactly what you said. You know, you should not be telling a reader what a book is or what it does, because what it does for you is different from what it's going to do for them.
Exactly. And I 100% agree with that. It's perspective, it's life. Someone could read something and have lived a totally different life than you and get that thing that you might not get. Or, I mean, I feel like that's, with many books that I've reread that I read when I was younger, I've gotten a deeper appreciation for it because I've lived a different life than I did when I was younger. And it just it's important to go back. And this is a challenge for all the listeners out there too. Go back and read something you read 10, 20 years ago and see how you feel about it now. And it might be totally different.
And if the book is a really if the book is a really good one, it'll tell you how you've changed.
Yeah.
You know, it's almost like reading that book will tell you how different you are from the person you were when you last read it.
Exactly. And how much you've grown. Like, even if I've had that with some books where I read them and I realized that I don't feel the same way I felt either positive or negative. And I'm just like, oh, that's because I've learned new things and I am a different person. It's like that. Yeah. I think of that. Isn't there like a study or something that you're a new person every 7 years, because literally your body, through food and your environment, just the cells are
I think your cells are supposed to change. That's right.
Cells are supposed to change. So you're literally a new person than you were 7 years before. So of course you changed. So I think that's very important in getting that emotion. I feel like, especially, I mean, I said that after your reading, I felt that emotion there. I felt the emotion in the book, and I think the listeners will too, and people. I mean, also, I didn't even talk about the cover. The cover is beautiful.
Yeah.
I actually held a physical. I held a physical copy of it last night, and I was like, "Wow, this is a beautiful book." That we're putting on the store, and I was just looking at the cover, and I was like, people are gonna look at this and buy it because of how beautiful it looks.
Oh, I hope so. I mean, I do think it looks great. It's just, and very subtly, it's got the Catalan colors, yellow and red.
Yes.
But, I think the reason why, you started it off so beautifully because your reaction to the reading was wonderful. And the way you just started talking about the emotion of it and the compassion. And that was such a great way to go into the interview, rather than simply starting with the first question that you wrote down sometime earlier today, So I appreciate your naturalness.
No, I appreciate you being a great conversation partner. I mean, this has been so fun, first off, just to be able to have this conversation, but also just so, I don't know, intellectual, not in the pretentiousness of intellectualism, but intellectual in the sense of I feel like I've learned and grown through this conversation and realized, we realize things that I didn't even realize I knew in that way. And that's, I feel like, what makes a good conversation. So thank you for giving me that.
Thank you.
No, this has been fantastic. Do you have any last things you would like to say to, you know, the listeners and the book lovers in the bookstore community as a whole?
Oh, I only have two things to say. One is directed at writers or would-be writers, and it's a quote from this one of my all-time favorite writers, who's Isaac Dinesen, who she's also known as Karen Blixen. She wrote Out of Africa, this famous memoir called Out of Africa, which was turned into a film. But actually, much more interesting are her incredible short stories called Winter's Tales and Last Tales. She writes these extraordinary, enigmatic, mysterious, fable-like short stories, you know, to go back to what we were talking about earlier. She's always been a great inspiration for me. And she says this in one of her stories, which I think is great advice for writers. Be not afraid of absurdity. Do not shrink from the fantastic. Within a dilemma, choose the most unheard of, the most dangerous solution. Be brave, be brave. So that's one thing. And then the other thing is for all the readers out there, and I just want to say really simply, you have to support the independent bookstores. Please go to SKYLIT and buy your books there. But there's also, you know, actually Los Angeles has quite a number of great bookstores, great independent bookstores. Book Soup is the most famous one, I guess, but there are plenty of others. What's that one in Westwood? Which I've done a reading at.
Romans, yeah.
Can't remember.
Romans.
But anyway, I mean, that's the thing I wanted to say. Just let's support the independent bookstores.
Yes, and that's I mean, like, every bookstore in Los Angeles. You know, I mean, one of my favorite things to do when I go to a new city is go to as many of the independent bookstores as I can. And I mean, London also isn't short of amazing independent bookstores.
We have less than we used to, but you know, because like everywhere, the chains have kind of taken over a little bit. But no, we still have some great ones.
I mean, my favorite, which one? Gaze the Word was my favorite out there. But also like just there's too many to name. But thank you for. What's your favorite out there? Your favorite independent bookstore out there?
What, in London?
Yeah.
I love one. There's a couple actually, but I love the one in the East End, which is called Burley Fisher. Basically, I have a relationship with them because they supplied books. When I have book launches, when books come out, I've always had great parties. I love to have a party for a book, and it's really unfortunate that this is the second of my books that's come out during lockdown, so second time I'm not having a party. But Burley Fisher supplied sold books at my last book launch, so they're a terrific bookstore. And there's one in the West called Lutchins and Rubenstein, which is in Notting Hill. That's a great one. But there's John Sandow in Chelsea. You know, we have a lot of bookstores. So yeah, it's hard to support bookstores because we're out of the habit of going to them, you know, and we've had to be ordering our books online. But I don't know, we've got to get back in the habit, and because it's just not the same when you browse online. You know, if you're in a bookstore, my favorite bookstore, I have to say, in the US is probably City Lights, you know.
Because City Light books.
Because, you know, I had this great experience where I was on a book tour. I can't even remember when it was, probably 20 years ago now. And I got to San Francisco, and in those days you used to have someone pick you up from the airport. They'd be your escort in the city. They'd take you to the bookstore for the event and take you to your hotel and stuff. And the guy who was driving me, he said, "Is there anywhere you want to go particularly?" And I said, "I want to go to City Lights because I've never seen it." And he said, "I don't normally take authors there because their books are never stocked there. So they go into the bookstore and they just don't find their books, and then they're just really sad and disappointed." I said, "Well, I don't care if they don't stock my books. You know, I just want to see the place and walk around and smell it and feel it, and you know." Because of the history of it, you know, it has this incredible history. So anyway, I got to the bookstore, I got to City Lights, and I walked in, and then I found 3 of my books on the shelf.
Oh my God, it was meant to be.
So immediately I went upstairs. I went to the kind of manager's office, and it's run by this great guy called Paul Yamazaki. And we sort of became friends, actually. So I love that store.
No, it's one of, I mean, I know so much about the history. I've never been, but it's on my list to go visit there because for that, honestly, one of the reasons I want to go to that city is just to see City Lights books. So no, that's, I mean,
that's enough of a reason, Lance. It's enough of a reason.
It's a wonderful, no, I have no shame for that reason at all. Well, this has been fantastic. And amazingly enough, to the listeners, on the day we're recording, the 1st of June, is the paperback release in the US, right? So
Today is the day.
Yeah, is it the US only or the UK too?
UK is a week today, next Tuesday.
A week today, next Tuesday. Yeah. So, but no, so go on. You have no excuse to not grab this book. It'll be out both in the US and the UK when this podcast comes out. So go grab it. Go look at the cover because I promise you'll see this cover and be intrigued. But go grab yourself a copy and just immerse yourself in the wonderful city of Barcelona. This was Rupert Thomson with his book Barcelona Dreaming. You can order it now on www.skylightbooks.com or just go into Skylight Books and grab a copy. It'll be on display with our podcast section, but also in our fiction section. You'll find it. So come on by. Thank you so much, Rupert, for coming on today. This has been a pleasure, and thank you to the listeners again for coming back and listening to our wonderful podcast. You have a beautiful rest of your day, and we'll be back soon. Bye.
Thank you for listening to the Skylight Books podcast series. Please don't forget to visit our website at skylightbooks.com and make sure to follow us on Twitter and Instagram. Also, don't forget to subscribe to this podcast for more author talks and bookseller conversations. You can find us on Podbean, iTunes, and Spotify. Stay safe and healthy, and we hope to see you back in our store soon.
I see